Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start shortly. We're just going to give people a few more minutes. In my experience, always have a few stragglers. So just hold tight and we'll begin in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Okay, welcome everyone to our panel discussion today about curating the music festival and specifically about approaches to new repertoires. How do we incorporate new repertoires? How do we get audiences interested in new repertoires? How do we sort of compellingly program new repertoires? Those are all the kinds of things that we'll be talking about today. I'm so honored to have our two guest speakers, Liubov Morozova and Christopher Gibbs, who will be joining us. So they will each be giving a presentation, and then at the end, we'll have time for basically an open Q&A. And I'll say this again a little bit later, but if you have questions as they come up, feel free to put them in the chat or even just to kind of indicate, hey, I have a question, and we can unmute you and you can have a interaction with the speakers. But if you just want to pose a question, we can also ask that on your behalf. So you can just put those kinds of things in the chat. So we're gonna start with Luba. So Luba is a musicologist and a music critic. She's been the artistic director of the Kyiv Symphony Orchestra since 2018. And as a curator, she's been involved in a huge number of projects, which she will talk to you a little bit about today. But some of the most important are she's the curator of the music program at the Book Arsenal in Kyiv and also the Bouquet Stage Kyiv, which is a music festival, which we're going to hear some more about. She has also, as a musicologist, developed a number of courses where she looks at things like the musical avant-garde of the 1920s and 30s, as well as more contemporary music. As a public musicologist, she has been the co-host of the program Lectures in Music on Ukrainian Culture Television. And she's also been a radio host for a program on Hromadsky Radio, which if you're Ukrainian, you'll know is sort of the big national radio station. She's a member of the committee of the Shevchenko National Prize of Ukraine, which is a big prize for culture, writers, musicians, and she is among the committee members who decided the recipients of that prize. She's also been working in journalism since 2005, and she has a huge library of articles, more than 900 articles in both domestic publications in Ukraine as well as foreign periodicals translated into various languages. So we're really, really proud that she is willing to join us here today, and look forward to, hearing her perspective on work that's going on in Ukraine around new repertoires. So she's prepared a presentation. I'm just gonna share that. Okay.
My name is Liubov Morozova. Hello, dear connoisseurs of Ukrainian music and those interested in the challenges and processes of bringing new repertoires to a wider audience. My name is Liubov Morozova, and I am a musicologist, TV and radio host, music program curator for several Ukrainian festivals, and the artistic director of the Kyiv Symphony Orchestra. Let me explain why my activities turned out to be so diverse. Since 2005, I have worked as a music critic for various Ukrainian publications, but I first played the role of curator of an art forum in Kyiv in 2014. This project, called Don Cult, was dedicated to the art of Donbass and initiated because of the Russian aggression in the east of Ukraine and the mass migration of Donbass residents. The aim of the curators from various artistic spheres was to remind Kyivans, and in 2015 the residents of Lviv, that Donbass is and was a part of Ukraine, and its unique culture is inextricably linked with the history and customs of other regions of Ukraine. Having gained curatorial experience in this project, I joined the teams of several new festivals that emerged after the 2014 Maidan Revolution and were certainly the result of democratic changes in Ukraine. So I found myself on both sides of the process, as an organizer of events and as a critic. Therefore, I can say a lot about the state of Ukrainian music in the last 5 years, using my own projects as examples. I'm going to tell you about some festivals and concerts of contemporary music that took place in Odessa and Kyiv. Among them are Odessa Classics, Bouquet Kyiv Stage, and the concerts of Kyiv Symphony Orchestra. In 2017, the third Odessa Classics Festival included a program of contemporary music concerts. The founder of the festival, pianist Alexei Botvinov, proposed to program exclusively works by contemporary Ukrainian composers, which was a bold step for the largest festival of classical music in Odessa. At this time, the only festival that has been presenting contemporary music in Odessa every year since 1995 was the 2 days and 2 nights of new music. This new music marathon, which brought together the best Ukrainian and foreign performers and composers, was an event for fans of new music from all over Ukraine, and they came to Odessa every spring. However, It was addressed to a narrow audience of professional musicians. The inclusion of the program of new Ukrainian music in the Odessa Classics Festival, designed for a wide audience. Some open-air festival events gather 10,000 or more listeners, testified to a recognition that contemporary music is a successor to a long classical tradition. In 2017, the contemporary music program of the festival was called New Ukrainian Soundscapes and included works by composers of different generations. Among the younger composers were Oleksiy Ritinsky, Ivan Ostapovich, Petro Tityayev, Oleksiy Shmurak, Maxim Kolomiyets, Oleg Shpudeyko, Oleksiy Voitenko, and Dmytro Arefyev. Of these, Shmurak, Kolomiyets, and Shpudeyko also performed music that contained elements of musical happening, to use John Cage's term, in a project called The Death and the Birth of Objects. The performance presented objects of everyday use as sound characters. The goal of this approach was to bring back to life familiar things from childhood, which are now becoming obsolete, to know how once familiar to us items are slowly being replaced by their modern counterparts. Rotating disc landline phones, home video projectors, cassette recorders, old children's toys, vinyl players are disappearing and taking with them our memories, dreams, hopes, and just everyday thoughts. The idea of the project was to resurrect forgotten objects, to breathe into them a new, let alone sound life, to make them talk to us, to tell their story again. The composers of the middle generation were represented by Zoltan Almashi, Victoria Polyova, and Serhiy Pilyutikov. I must say that Zoltan Almashi is not only a talented composer, but also a cellist and one of the most active promoters of contemporary Ukrainian music. While preparing the concert, I asked Zoltan to present his works to the audience. His stories made the performance even more interesting for the audience. Because Almashi is not only an experienced musician, but also a very charismatic narrator. He belongs to the middle generation of composers. This generation is characterized by a strong influence of the oldest living generation of Ukrainian composers, including Valentin Silvestrov and Yevhen Stankovich, as well as a sense of independence, since the years of these authors coincided with the end of the USSR and the beginning of Ukraine's independence. Next, in 2017, Odessa Festival came a theatrical concert which combined the works of middle and older generations, as well as classics. It was presented by the violinist Miroslava Kotorovich together with the Artechata student ensemble and accordionist Igor Sayenko. The plot of the concert was based on the fairy drama Forest Song by Lesia Ukrainka. The music included works by composers of several different generations: Yevhen Stankovich, Miroslav Skorek, Volodymyr Zubitsky, Mikhailo Skorulski, Alexander Shimko, Zoltan Almashi, and Victoria Polyova. This event demonstrated that a concert of Ukrainian music can take on a large scale and be accessible to a wide audience and to unite several generations of composers, despite the different aesthetics of their works. In 2018, I helped curate the Odessa Classics Festival again. The program was called Handmade and aimed to draw attention to chamber music as a virtuoso, unique and intimate genre that contrasts globalization and replicated forms. There were two reasons for this focus. The first is that my parallel program took place in this format. The second was directly related to the venue. The new Urban Music Hall opened in Odessa a few months before the festival, and Handmade actually became the first festival programmed in the venue. From the very beginning, Urban Music Hall positions itself as a hall created for chamber projects, and thus artistic reflection on the theme for chamber music today was of the utmost relevance. It was important for me to emphasize that although today the performance quality is at the higher level than ever before in history, it is more difficult than ever to resist mass art and symphonic monumentalism. As a metaphor for the complex and unique work of the soloists, I chose the term handmade, which is clearly, simply, and accurately explains the difference between chamber music and other genres. The series of new music concerts was aimed to expose the qualities of the perfection of handicrafts so highly valued by the humanity. It also encouraged listeners to become co-creators of concerts because several projects were interactive. Overall, there were 7 concerts in that program, of which 5 were played by Ukrainian musicians and 2 by Polish and Austrian musicians. All of the concerts had to include works by Ukrainian composers in their program. Interestingly, foreign musicians independently found composers from Ukraine who interested them. Later, some of these contacts grew into long-term collaborations, such as a collaboration of the Austrian women's ensemble Airborne Extended and the Ukrainian composer and sound designer Alisa Kobzar. This ensemble also later included works by Ukrainian composers in its permanent repertoire, and so many works by young Ukrainian authors have written specially for Airborne Extended that they can play full-fledged concerts composed exclusively of Ukrainian music. In 2018, the only open-air festival of high art in Ukraine started, the main program of which was classical music, Bouquet, Kyiv stage. One of the most important features of the festival is that all events take place on the territory of significant historical sites, such as the territory around Kyiv St. Sophia Cathedral and the Golden Gates. Both monuments were built in the 11th century and are major historical landmarks. When our team first started working with these sites, we were worried that the festival might become too traditional. This was especially true of St. Sophia of Kyiv, which is an important religious side of Orthodox culture. Meanwhile, it turned out that the management of the park was open to everything new, even to cutting-edge experimental music. From the very beginning, this festival was aimed at telling a story about creative individuals, Ukrainian artists. We wanted to emphasize that geniuses are here, nearby, and their talent should be noticed and nurtured. We were concerned that society is often unable to evaluate and recognize gifted individuals and doesn't cherish or nurture talented people. For this reason, some of them immigrate from Ukraine, not so much in pursuit of income, but in search for recognition. We are faced with a paradox. In order to gain recognition in his or her homeland, a Ukrainian musician must first be recognized in the West. In order to deal with this situation, Bouquet Kyiv stage began to invite leading Ukrainian soloists who now reside abroad. The festival is founded by its organizers, so that all events of the festival are free for the audience, because the idea of Bouquet, as the name of the festival implies, is a gift to the city. The audience only needs to pay for the admission to the park, similarly to free concerts in museums in New York, where you only pay for museum admission. Bouquet Kyiv stage aimed at reaching the audience of all ages. It is a festival that combines classical, electroacoustic and jazz concerts, conducting and vocal workshops, art and photo exhibitions, film screening, theatrical tours, conversations about culture, interactive programs for children and programs for the elderly. For example, in 2019, on August 24th, Ukrainian Independence Day, the musical program was as follows. At 6 p.m., there was a concert of the art rock crossover vocal duo Telnyuk Sisters, accompanied by the Presidential Orchestra of Ukraine. Their songs set the text by major Ukrainian poets Bogdan Igor Antonich, Taras Shevchenko, as well as the Pope John Paul II and Paul Celan. Then at 9 p.m., one of the world's best ensembles of the modern music, Proton Bern, who came from Switzerland, performed a work called Lesbian Scene, a work composed as a 50-minute Rastal theatre. Their complex modern composition required us to find a rare Vox B77 reel-to-reel tape recorder, played like a real instrument together with acoustic instruments. Yet, this repertoire fit into the nightmare view of St. Sophia Cathedral, despite the complexity of the score and its unusual combination with the sacred place, even though the cathedral is now a museum. The audience received the work enthusiastically. In the end, it turned out to be one of the best and most impressive concerts of the whole festival. Finally, at 11 p.m. on the same night, pianist Evgen Hromov played a program of works dedicated to birds and the night. For example, there were night pieces and sad birds by Maurice Ravel, small sketches of birds by Olivier Messiaen, The Night by Ferenc Liszt, etc. The piano pieces, which were created to be performed in the chamber hall, sounded completely unusual at night in the open air. They mixed with the singing of live birds and the sounds of the street. So even romantic scores acquired a completely new, modern sound. In 2020, Bouquet Kyiv stage became one of the few Kyiv festivals that took place despite quarantine. Of course, in the open air and in compliance with all epidemiological norms. And it was necessary to see how the Kyiv audience listened to the works of Ukrainian composers Victoria Polyova, Valentin Silvestrov, Boris Liatoshinsky, and others. This included a 4-hour marathon of the modernist works of Liatoshinsky, from the 1920s, most of which were little known until recently. Yevhen Hromov, a world-famous Ukrainian pianist, became the organizer and the main performer in 2020. Finally, I would like to talk about my major project of the last 3 years, the Kyiv Symphony Orchestra, a state-funded orchestra with 40-year history that is currently undergoing a revolutionary renewal. A rare fusion of Ukrainian sensual musicality and a Western analytical attitude to the text was created from the union of the state orchestra and the Italian conductor Luigi Gaggera. Unusual for Kyiv orchestras, the invitation of a foreigner to the position of chief conductor came from the ambitious desire of the musicians to create interpretations that are simultaneously fresh and historically informed. The orchestra's outstanding quality is also possible because the orchestra rehearses ad libitum. And it prepares each program for several weeks, paying a lot of attention to every detail of the score. The orchestra's international repertoire stretches from the music of the 16th century to the youngest generation of contemporary composers. The orchestra also cares about the preservation and promotion of Ukrainian masterpieces. The Kyiv Symphony Orchestra conveys the idea that tradition should not be seen, as often the case, as a reference to the past, but rather as the essential element preserved over the centuries and at the core of our identity, and should therefore be seen as the most important value we must pass on to the next generation. For example, a year ago, for the first time in Ukraine, we performed Volodymyr Zagortsev's work Gradations. This performance became the Ukrainian premiere, which finally happened 53 years after it was written and 9 years after the author's death. The only performance of Gradations took place in January 1980, and it became the greatest international success of Zagortsev's music, under the direction of the famous conductor Zubin Mehta, performed by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Alexei Voitenko retyped the score of the basis of the preserved manuscript. It took him several months. It was an extremely time-consuming score, and its manuscript is largely based on the controlled aleatoric techniques with all sorts of graphic notation. Another interesting case was the performance of one of the major Ukrainian works of the 20th century, Гуцул Triptych, by Miroslav Skorik, in which he used his music for Sergei Parajanov's film The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. It has been performed by numerous Ukrainian orchestras dozens of times, but having studied the score, Luigi Gaggera decided to completely change the meter grid in the first part of the triptych. The meter in the piece is 7 quarters, but it's written down for 2. By reorganization, the demarcation of the bars, the whimsical Guzul rhythmic structure turns in the march. Luigi corrected the score, and this caused a lot of controversy in our team, because this is our Ukrainian classic. Does an Italian know better than us how to play it, and so on? Finally, Luigi wrote a letter to Miroslav Skorik, asking a number of questions regarding interpretation, and invited the composer to rehearsals. After Maestro Gaggera conducted the completely rewritten first part, Maestro Skorik said, "Actually he, that is Luigi, is right. I transcribed the rhythm for a lazy orchestra and a lazy conductor to avoid confusions with the changes of the meter. But really, the melody flows to the way he conducts. Other Ukrainian music projects of the orchestra include the performance of Maxim Berezovsky's First Ukrainian Symphony, Dmitro Bortnyansky's Overture to the Falcon Opera, Levko Revutsky's Second Piano Concerto in the first edition, Boris Liatushinsky's Fifth Symphony, and new works by Igor Zagorodny and Maxim Kulomyts commissioned by the orchestra. Finally, as a concluding story of this presentation, I want to tell you about an important opera which premiered last year, in October last year, with the support of the Ukrainian Culture Foundation. The orchestra, under the direction of Luigi Gagera, premiered Maxim Kulomyts' new opera Night. The main character of the opera is the famous song What a Moonlit Night, Ніч яка місячна. The opera's libretto, written by Taras Frolov, is a product of a study of the almost 200-year history of the song, which itself reads almost like a detective story. The true story of the song is so complex and so interesting that it itself became the prototype for the libretto, which spans 9 different eras from the 19th century to the 21st. The ability of musical work to frame the events is a unique phenomenon that allows exploration of the song and the history of a single living organism. Its prototype appeared in 1831 when a series of short stories by Mykola Gogol, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, was published. In 1870, the luminary of Ukrainian National Theatre, Mikhailo Staritsky, wrote the poem Challenge, which was based on a text by Gogol. Staritsky took his text as a basis for a main character, Levko. During 1883-1884, together with Mykola Lysenko, they created an opera Drowned, Utoplena, based on Gogol's work with the same name. Eventually, the song became to be regarded as a folk song. As for the music setting, which is widely considered as folklore, it is not a serenade written by Lysenko at all, but a song by Kobzars, itinerant Ukrainian bards, Vasyl Ovchinnikov and Andriy Voloshenko. It was first published in the 1914 collection Bandura School, Shevchenko, Vasyl. I will not tell a further story here because it is quite long. I will only say that the song Ніч яка місячна was sung by the troops of Ukrainian insurgent army, then appeared in the opposite side of the Soviet film about the Second World War. I say opposite because it was sang by Soviet soldiers. And finally remained one of the most popular Ukrainian songs both at home and abroad. As Luigi Gagera commented about the opera, quote, "This opera reveals the fundamental meanings of memory. It allows us to see and understand our personal history and created connections between people. A society that has lost its memory cannot see itself, is unable to understand the meaning of historical events, is unable to be united." The impressive music of Maxim Kulomyts, with delicate sensitivity, strength and irony, possesses all these qualities in a personal language and at the same time grounded in the Ukrainian collective musical memory. What a Moonlit Night is memory, and memory is us. If we no longer can hear the song, the poetry will disappear from our lives. End quote. For me, the words of a foreigner about a work that is rooted in Ukrainian tradition and reflects its most essential codes are extremely important. When people coming from another culture can figure out these codes and become impressed and inspired by them, for me, this is the most important evidence of the value of my work as a curator and the work of Ukrainian composers.
Okay, Luba, thank you for that. Really fascinating. There's so much there to discuss, and I really look forward to the discussion. Before we do engage in the discussion, we're going to have our second presenter give a sort of response and also a compliment based on his experience of programming similarly unknown, unrepresented, underrepresented repertoires in the United States. So Christopher Gibbs is the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Music at Bard College, and he's the co-creative director of the Bard Music Festival, which some of you may know. Their mandate is to sort of bring to the surface works, either works that have been overlooked or composers that have been overlooked through a summer festival that they do each year. This is the 31st, the summer will be the 31st year, and it's quite a fantastic program. He is also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Schubert, as well as the author of The Life of Schubert, which has been translated into 5 different languages. He is also co-authored with Richard Tereskin, The Oxford History of Western Music, the college edition textbook, which some of the students who are here today may be familiar with. As a program annotator and lecturer, Gibbs has worked with leading musical institutions around the world. He was the musicological director for the final 3 years of the Schubertiad series at the 92nd Street Y here in New York City. And he also served as the musicological advisor for the Bicentennial Schubert Festival at Carnegie Hall. He has been writing program notes for the Philadelphia Orchestra for the past 20 seasons, and he frequently gives pre-concert lectures for that orchestra, as well as for Carnegie Hall, the New York Philharmonic, the Cleveland Orchestra, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the New York City Opera, MoMA, great performers at Lincoln Center, and many others. So we're really, really thrilled to have him here, to have him engaging in a conversation today about Ukrainian music. So he also has prepared a presentation, which I will now show, hopefully with less technical difficulties.
Hello, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to participate today. I'm grateful to Leah for the invitation, and I look forward to discussion in a few minutes and questions. What we just heard is something that I found very interesting, although I do something quite different in the nature of the festival that I'm involved with, the Bard Music Festival that I'll be discussing. We have a very similar goal. What Luba said was to the challenge of bringing new repertory to wider audiences. And what she is doing is a festival, as we see, that really is much more focused on cutting edge, new experimental music and really exploring the present. The Bard Music Festival focuses each summer, now our 31st year, on a composer, a single composer from the past and the world around his or her life. And over the course of some 2 weekends and 12 concerts or so in August on the campus of Bard College, which is about 100 miles north of New York City, we present a really in-depth look at the composer and his or her world. And this includes teachers and students, friends and enemies, obscure works. And the goal really is to expand the repertory that has become in the classical music world really very narrow, more and more a focus on really a few dozen pieces that we hear endlessly, and to the exclusion of a great many important and wonderful figures from the past. We don't do this with literature of just reading again and again Middlemarch or two Shakespeare plays. We have a greater sense of curiosity and desire to look at and read and listen to many different things. And that has been lost a good deal in the world of classical music, and the Bard Music Festival attempts to broaden that and put it all into a context. It was founded in 1990 by Leon Botstein, the president of Bard College, who is also a historian and a conductor. And he has been a pioneer in what could broadly be called thematic programming, particularly as the music director of the American Symphony Orchestra and then with the Bard Music Festival. And the idea here is, rather than go to a concert and hear an Italian overture and a Czech concerto and a German symphony that if it were a restaurant might give you indigestion, that there is a focus, a theme to each concert. And Luba is clearly doing that as well, of looking, for example, around obsolete objects that she was talking about. So there might be a theme around having to do with something with literature or history for a specific concert. Well, that expands a good bit when we explore the world around a particular composer. Began in 1990 with Johannes Brahms, and now we are about to explore our 31st composer this coming summer. Since we're on a college campus, that gives us a good many opportunities and advantages, but also in some ways mandates and a somewhat different sort of mission, and that is to combine together scholarship and performance and interaction with a broad audience. So from the beginning, with Brahms in 1990, there has been a scholarly book that is published for the first 30 years by Princeton University Press. We have now just moved to the University of Chicago. So that is something that has an impact far beyond the college and the festival. These books are in all the major libraries of the world and available to buy. The two most recent, before the pandemic, we did Erich Wolfgang Korngold. Perhaps not a household name, but this was a very important figure, particularly for film. He was born in, raised in Vienna, and had a great career there, one of the great prodigies in the history of music. We think of Mozart and Mendelssohn. Well, what Korngold did already before his teens completely astounded Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss and others of the time. And he had a great career in Vienna and in Europe, but as a Jew, he had to flee to America. He ended up in Hollywood, and he really invented the sound of the Hollywood film with Robin Hood and Seahawk and things that really set the way to today with John Williams and others. So it's somebody, a figure like that, who you might not think, well, you're going to have 12 concerts around this figure. It opens up vast worlds from Vienna and what that milieu was like, what it was like to be an immigrant in America, what Hollywood was like, what the whole issue of films are like, and so forth. Last summer, we had to postpone the festival, but since the book has to get in the works years in advance, it has already appeared, and this is Nadia Boulanger and her world. The first time, actually, that our focus has been on a woman, the central, really, figure in so many respects of 20th century music as a teacher, conductor, composer. Her sister, Lily Boulanger, was the first woman to win the Prix de Rome in France, and an absolutely fantastic composer. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 24, and so her compositional legacy, although astonishing in the quality of the work, does not have such a great quantity to it. So over the course of these 12 or so concerts, each of which have a pre-concert lecture to sort of set it up for the audience, and we have panels and other ancillary activities. There's also a handsome program book with program notes on the concert and art and timeline and so forth. This provides a context for what will be a good amount of rather unfamiliar, neglected repertory that needs to be rediscovered. Now, of course, in all cases, the opportunity is to put works that are very well known, that maybe are over familiar, and put it into more of its original context, put it in to juxtaposition of a rival composer, for example, and relive debates of the War of the Romantics in the mid-19th century, and so forth. So I see some of these things as resonating with what we've just heard of the festival there, but here is something that allows us as well to explore the neglected and underrepresented, and therefore we could say new repertory as well. You need to have audiences that are curious and that trust you to come to things that they may not recognize the names of most of the composers on a given concert, but that they have the experience maybe from past years of knowing that this becomes a fascinating experience. We have a wide variety of types of music that we play. We have two halls here, a smaller chamber music hall, and then a beautiful performing arts center designed by Frank Gehry, the great architect. That is a sort of architectural wonder, but also a wonderful concert hall with terrific acoustics. So that allows us to do full-scale operas and symphonic concerts, choral masterpieces, and so forth. For the chamber music concerts, we don't do it as a sort of normal recital that you would hear a pianist play or a string quartet give a concert. We mix it all up. We believe of hearing different sonorities. So we're not just juxtaposing different composers, but also it may open with a piano suite, and then hear some songs, and then hear a woodwind quintet, an intermission, then a piano trio, and end with a choral piece. So potentially there are 35 musicians playing on a chamber music concert that lasts 2 hours. But there's great variety and opportunity to make these sort of unusual juxtapositions as well. In all of this, I think we have a shared goal as well, which is to try to make connections beyond just musical ones, to connections to the real world, connections to history, to literature, to politics, and to see how this music came about, what was the genesis of it, what was the initial reception, what was the legacy of it. These are things that we're more used to within the world, perhaps, of the visual arts, of going to an exhibition at a museum that is wonderfully curated. And I love that word etymologically, of course. It comes from the idea of caring. And so you curate a museum, you bring together thematically things that make sense of how you display them on the wall, what you put there as an explanation. There are oftentimes, of course, gallery talks and lectures and symposia around it, and usually a catalog, such as the book that we do it. So it makes it a very rich and immersive experience. I think, unfortunately, concert life and festivals tend not to be curated too much. And it's filled with wonderful music, with terrific performances, but is really thoughtless in the way that things are so often put together. And our goal has been exactly to curate, to make connections, and ultimately we hope to expand the repertory. There's a challenge here as well of finding musicians that will learn repertory that is unfamiliar to them, and oftentimes realize they may not have chances to perform again. It's a wonderful feeling when we ask a string quartet or a piano trio to learn an unfamiliar piece and then see that they retain it in their repertory and they play it other places. And it really, this is something that helps expand the more general repertory. If we ask a pianist to learn an obscure piano concerto or a violinist a violin concerto, they realize that there's a good chance that this will be the sole performance they'll give of it, to get a major orchestra to be willing to go along with an unfamiliar piece is an uphill battle. And yet oftentimes they do this, they memorize the piece, and they thank us for the chance to be playing a violin concerto that is not the Sibelius or Brahms violin concerto, as marvelous as they are, but they play it dozens of times a season. And so they are in some ways refreshed by hearing and playing music that has been neglected. And sometimes, to use the example of the Brahms violin concerto, we paired that once with Joseph Joachim's violin concerto. Joseph Joachim was a great violinist, great friend of Brahms, for whom Brahms wrote his violin concerto, as did Schumann and Dvorak and Bruch, but also Joachim was himself a composer, and his Hungarian violin concerto is clearly something that Brahms learned a lot from. Now, I'm not going to be making the claim that it is as exalted as Brahms is, but how wonderful to hear a piece that influenced his friend and that is absolutely fantastic. As I said before, we don't do this with literature of putting everything in sort of order of greatness. We are much more open to looking at and reading things that are absolutely fantastic in their own right. So I look forward to discussing some of these issues that I think, even with quite different context and different places, share some of the challenges and the opportunities when one curates concerts and really does it all in a thoughtful and really deliberate manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for these really fascinating presentations. I hope that we'll have a lot of stimulating discussion. So as I said at the start, if you're watching here, you can feel free to drop your question in the chat and we can ask it on your behalf. Or if you would like to pose the question yourself and engage with the speakers, just sort of make a note in the chat that you have a question and we can unmute you. If you are joining us from Ukraine, we also do have with us an interpreter, so we can, there's our interpreter, Oksana Nestorenko, who's also a member of the Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival's team. So please feel free to write your question in Ukrainian. We can translate questions, we can translate answers. So I will just sort of say that and open it up now to our audience. I mean, before we get into audience questions, I will kick it off with a question for both of you, which is, do you think that things have changed recently? I mean, in Ukraine, we have sort of this pivotal moment with Maidan, and I think we are seeing some changes happening around curating and representations of repertoire and challenging the idea of the canon, sort of recently happening in the United States. But do you feel that in the time that you have been been doing these projects, has there been a change in kind of the audience response or the interest or the support for these projects? I'm just curious.
Я, якщо можна, буду відповідати українською, мене про це попросили наші громадяни. Я одразу дякую Оксані, яка зголосилася перекладати, і я думаю, що я буду короткими фразами говорити, щоб це було легко перекласти. Перше, що я хочу сказати, що змінилося після Майдану, це те, що зріс запит на проекти, які пов'язані з усвідомленням українців як самих себе, а отже на проекти, які говорять про національну тематику, але говорять про неї дуже широко. Я можу продовжувати, Оксана, чи краще фрагментами?
Я можу перекласти. So the first big change that happened after the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine was that the demand for projects that are related to national identity or national consciousness quite broadly, this demand has increased significantly.
І, власне, якщо говорити про Майдан і про українську революцію, яка відбулася у 2013-2014 році, то ми говоримо певним чином про романтичну епоху, тому що загалом європейські революції відбувалися в епоху романтизму. І якраз під час романтизму було важливо усвідомити себе. Через те, що Україна була під іншими державами довгий час, вона була частиною імперій. Через це усвідомлення відбувається саме сьогодні. І ми можемо сказати, що ми зараз живемо фактично в романтичну епоху.
As for the specific time that around the Revolution of Dignity on Maidan in 2014 and the period that followed right after that, we can talk about it as a romantic period because all significant revolutions in Europe have occurred during the Romantic era. So we can compare this revolution to that period, and the consciousness of people is kind of similarly related to growth of national identity, as we know in the 19th century it was similar.
І тому я можу сказати, що ці процеси, вони є загальними для всієї української культури, не лише для музики, але для української моди, для популярної музики, для архітектури, для усвідомлення себе на рівні презентації. Я знаю багатьох людей, які саме після Майдану вперше перейшли на українську мову. Отже, оцей запит на українське тут в Україні, він зріс настільки, наскільки він ніколи не зростав.
And the same process, we can talk about this in all other arts. So in the fashion, we can see Ukrainian national elements in popular music and architecture. So the demand for everything Ukrainian has increased. And this is a result of many people have started of this growth of national consciousness, and many people have started speaking Ukrainian more than they used to before. They have realized that this is actually their native language, not the language that was imposed on them during the past century. So yeah, is this it?
Дякую. І останнє, що я хочу сказати на запитання Лії, це те, що сьогоднішній процес, він вирізняється тим, що Україна намагається поставити себе у всесвітній контекст. Саме тому, коли ми говоримо про сучасні програми музичні, чим вони відрізняються від програм, які були до того, а у нас безумовно звучала українська музика, вони вирізняються тим, що українська музика звучить у програмах поруч із західноєвропейською, американською, японською та іншими музиками. І через це ми усвідомлюємо не лише те, наскільки багатими музично ми є, а і про те, що ми всі є на одній хвилі.
And another important trend in programming music in Ukraine right now is that we are trying to put Ukrainian music in the context of world music. So to program Ukrainian works alongside Western European or Japanese or American or any other world music. And in this way to show the connections between Ukrainian culture and world culture, and many similarities that are between these cultures. Is this?
So from I see some positive developments for a variety of reasons over the past few decades. One is just a sort of general sort of relevance of the classical music scene, and Leah, as you just said, issues right now of diversity, equity, and inclusion have really changed things that have happened in the past 6 months or so of a lot of programming, even during the time of the pandemic.
Christopher бачить багато позитивних також змін в розвитку програм класичної музики. Класична музика в Америці, особливо за останні 6 місяців, стала набагато мати більше відношення до того, що насправді відбувається у громадськості, тобто проблеми, які саме турбують звичайну людину, вони більше себе проявляють ніби в репертуарі, який програмується. Тобто це не тільки... So did you mean that not only the genius classical composers are programmed, but we are also trying to choose like more underrepresented, right?
Yes, unfamiliar names, and I think this is part of a larger, as I say, sort of relevance, and it raises the issue of the so-called death of classical music, which I don't believe in. It's changing always, but of drawing in audiences that maybe themselves didn't grow up playing the piano and reading music and so forth, but they very much want to relate music to the arts, to literature, and therefore a theme for a concert or for a festival is something that's, I think, more attractive and more necessary maybe than it was 50 years ago.
Тобто зараз набагато більше почали включати в програми тих композиторів, яких раніше дуже мало виконували. Це, наприклад, тобто різні композитори з тих верств суспільства, які менше виконувалися, наприклад, темношкірі чи латиноамериканці. Зараз їх виконують набагато більше, і також більше уваги приділяється тій музиці, яка говорить про проблеми, які турбують справді суспільство. Тобто є дуже велика частина аудиторії, яка, можливо, виросла в не дуже багатих сім'ях, не мала можливості отримати класичну музичну освіту, чи навчитися грати на якомусь інструменті. Але це все аудиторія, яка може також ходити на класичні концерти, яка також може зацікавитися класичною музикою. Тобто зараз розширяється репертуар для того, щоб цим людям, які не мали можливості знати багато про класичну музику вже, щоб їм також було цікаво слухати цю нову класичну музику з новою тематикою.
Можна я запитаю Крістофера? Нам дозволено це робити?
So Luba wants to ask you a question.
Крістофере, дуже хотіла вас запитати про роль куратора сьогодні. Чому я запитую? Тому що сьогодні, коли у всіх є Facebook, Instagram, TikTok та інші платформи, фактично кожна людина є творцем, кожна людина є артистом. І є таке судження, що насправді професійний артист – це не той, хто лише виробляє продукт, а хто його організує. Отже, куратор, якщо говорити про ці процеси, він, на мій погляд, вже є артистом. Як ви, який ваш погляд, як ви вважаєте, ким сьогодні є куратор?
Just a second.
Thanks.
So Luba wants to ask a question about what do you think about the role of curator today, how it has changed from the past, and the major change that she observes is that today everyone wants to be an artist. Everyone has access to so much diverse information from like social media and so on. She believes that professional artist is not only the one who creates something, but also someone who can organize different did you mean
yeah, different activities, different art activities. So you it is that who is not only producing something, but could be an organizer of something. And in this case, if you organize, so is curator an artist too, or no?
I like to think so, and I see it a lot with my students. Actually, you know, on the one hand, I've been involved for such a long time with orchestras, particularly the Philadelphia Orchestra, that remains primarily a Rossini overture and a concerto and a symphony on a given concert. But what I see students doing, we have a conservatory of music at Bard, and when they're putting together recitals, it is much more curated. It's not just that they want to play the standard, you know, for a piano recital, Bach, Chopin, and end with a Beethoven sonata. There's a lot more interest in contemporary music. The festival I do is about dead composers, but you mentioned John Cage, and the John Cage archive is housed at Bard, and we do a lot of contemporary music in other ways. And I think that that does lead to, as you say, a type of creativity and also increasingly mixed media. So a student may work with somebody in the film or dance or theater department and make more of a happening in that regard than a standard recital. So it all becomes much more creative.
Ну, Крістофер хоче порівняти те, як його свою роботу, наприклад, з філадельфійським симфонічним оркестром, в якому програма часто складається з там увертюри Россіні і таких дуже класичний абсолютно репертуар, дуже часто повторюючися від одного виступу до іншого. А з другого боку, це його студенти в університеті Бард, де він викладає, які є набагато більш творчими у своєму кураторському підходу до своїх концертних виступів. Тобто вони, по-перше, вони завжди шукають якісь цікавий репертуар різних композиторів, молодих композиторів, які ще живуть. І з другого боку, вони також дуже зацікавлені в тому, щоб спілкуватися зі студентами з інших факультетів. Тобто вони можуть зробити свій випускний концерт разом з театральним факультетом, танцювальним факультетом, якимось ще мистецьким, тобто співпрацюють. Тобто в цьому плані студент більш як артист виступає, ніж куратор якогось фестивалю, в якому такого дуже стандартного, в якому завжди грається те ж саме.
Я тут хотіла уточнити, якщо можна, для українських слухачів. Справа в тому, що в російській бард це є автор, який складає пісні і співає їх під гітару. Тут просто я розумію, що дехто не зрозумів, що таке бард-фестивал. Якщо можна, щоб Крістофер пояснив це для українських слухачів.
Okay, so there is a slight confusion with the name Bard College and Bard Festival because in Ukrainian language there is a word Bard, which is a sort of a singer-songwriter.
In English too.
Yes, in English.
So
Shakespeare is our bard.
Right.
So the Ukrainian audience thought that Bard Festival is the festival of bards. And Luba just wanted, but I don't think there is.
Yes, thank you. No, it's the college was founded in 1860 by John Bard. So it is a college that has a long history, and in part because our president of the college for now almost 50 years, Leon Botstein, is a musician and musicologist. There is a lot of music at Bard College, and a conservatory and a festival and a Frank Gehry building and so forth. So it's a nice pun. You're right. We're singing in the bardic tradition, but also we look back to a person who founded the college.
Ну, Крістофер говорить, що це дуже гарна гра слів, звичайно, що бард – це також бард як співець. Ми також в нашому коледжі співаємо, але бард – це є звичайний коледж ліберальних мистецтв, в якому є багато різних факультетів, який був заснований у 1860 році Джоном Бардом. Тобто це просто прізвище засновника коледжа Джон Бард. Але цей коледж, він знаходиться десь 4 години їзди від Нью-Йорка, але в такому більш живописному місці. В цьому коледжі вже 50 років президентом є Леон Ботстайн. Це такий музикознавець, диригент і взагалі любитель музики. Тому в цьому саме коледжі дуже багато уваги приділяється музиці, і оцей музичний фестиваль – це один з прикладів цього.
I want to take a question from the Q&A. So we actually have someone joining us from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So really excited to have such a far reach, and thank you so much.
Hi, David. Hi.
Oh, I see. Okay. David, do you want to pose your question? We can also, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I can read question. Thank you. Thank you for the fantastic webinar. I am from Bosnia, and I have a question for both of you. I'm curious, are you open to foreign composers in their music, and mostly how they should approach to you, as we all know how hard now is for young composers, emerging composers, to get on the road with the commissions and the major music festivals of contemporary music. It mostly goes by recommendations and mutual friends, etc., which is sometimes a bit unfair. So, and I just want to mention that in the past few years, I was twice in Ukraine. First time on the Kyiv Contemporary Music Days, and the second time last year at the Sound and Vision, organized by the Zhenko Center and British Council. And I won the prize for the contemporary music for film. So I'm glad to see that you have such a rich development of the contemporary music scene. And I must say that I was not aware that it is that much developed in Ukraine. Thank you.
So I'm gonna riff on that a little bit and just sort of say, reframe a bit and just say, can both of you talk about sort of how you decide on what repertoire? I mean, Christopher, you mentioned that the Bard Festival is planned years and years in advance, and that you probably know who you're going to be sort of focusing on for the next few years. But who makes that decision? How do you decide about that? And then Luba, of course, you're curating many things all the time that are very diverse. And so again, how do you come across the composers that you decide to program?
Yes, I actually had a similar question just to follow up. So especially for large festivals, do you have like a curator for each day, or you have and like who creates? So Christopher, you described like a really nice way how that the festival needs to have a vision, and each day needs to have a vision for the audience to better digest. Like, how do you choose? Who makes these decisions?
Well, in the case of our festival, we do have to choose the focus, the composer that's going to be the center years in advance because of the book that will come out. And we usually hire one or two scholars to edit that book that can be consultants. And we have a committee of some people that have worked with us over the years that also advise us. And I just would have to say it's a really fascinating process that I learn so much from each year, because it's a complete immersion into the world of a composer. And you begin to see who the teachers and the students and who, if it's a composer who was also a performer, like for Chopin, we did Chopin a few years ago. And Chopin, as we all know, wrote 2 wonderful piano concertos at the age of 18, at the very beginning of his career when he was still in Poland. And we wondered, where did this come from? Because it doesn't really sound like Mozart or Beethoven, that we know what those piano concertos are like. So we looked at what piano concertos Chopin, as a teenage pianist, performed himself. Mm-hmm. And we saw that it was by figures that are pretty much forgotten, like Hummel and Moscheles and Kalkbrenner. And we began to look at these pieces and make connections. And so sort of Chopin programmed it for us. He dedicated one of his concertos to Kalkbrenner. We found out which concerto we played, and we performed that. And audiences sat there hearing something that sort of sounded like Chopin. And so it enriches their understanding of where Chopin comes from, which is not entirely Mozart and not Beethoven, but also other virtuoso pianist composers of his day.
So you, as an artistic director, you research all of this.
It's a lot of research, but that's what makes it a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And I do it in collaboration with Leon Botstein has an encyclopedic mind and is interested in everything. And then we have these advisors, but also, as I say, sometimes the composers help us themselves of how they programmed, what they performed, what they were interested in. A few years ago, we did a festival around Alban Berg, which is not the easiest festival. It doesn't, Alban Berg, and we've done Schoenberg, does not sell a lot of tickets necessarily. We wanted to do an opera by Franz Schreker called Die Ferne Klang, The Distant Sound, which is a great opera. And Berg had been hired to do the piano vocal score for Universalis Publishers in Vienna. So he lived with this piece so intensely for a year. And if you are interested in Wozzeck and Lulu and other things from Berg, if you get to know that opera by Schreker, you know where a lot of things come from not only the sound world, but even the plot. And so it's fascinating to make these connections and then to perform Ferne Klang and try to get this piece that was once very popular back into the repertoire.
Let me translate.
Oksana, maybe we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can potentially go back and add some explanation in Ukrainian if needed, because I want to give Luba a chance to answer and don't want to sort of keep everyone on too long. But, Luba, can you speak a little bit about where you get your inspiration for what you program, how you put programs together?
Я думаю, що якщо можна, нехай Оксана буквально 2 слова скаже про те, що Крістофер сказав, якщо можна.
Перше, що саме специфіка цього фестивалю, це те, що вибирається композитор конкретний, якому буде присвячений фестиваль, заздалегідь за 2 роки до того, тому що до фестивалю також виходить книга про цього композитора. Для цього наймається консультант, який є спеціалістом саме по цьому композитору. І також, звичайно, є ціла група людей, які працюють над фестивалем взагалі. Як це advisory board?
Советчики,
комітет,
радники.
Наглядова рада.
Наглядова рада, так.
І найцікавіше, що він сказав, це те, що композитор, якого вони вибрали, може стати куратором цього фестивалю. Тобто, наприклад, вони вибрали композитором Шопена і взяли якісь його ранні твори і почали досліджувати, хто вплинув на його ці ранні твори. Таким чином натрапили на цікавих композиторів того часу, і що грав сам Шопен. І тобто ці твори були включені до програми. І подібна історія він розказав про Берга, що композитор Шрекер написав також оперу, яка така ж сама гарна, як Лулу чи Воцек. Тобто це такий дуже творчий процес дослідження кожного разу нового композитора.
Я тоді трішечки розкажу про свій досвід, і я думаю, що Оксана може його коротко перекласти теж. У нас інший тип будови фестивалів, монографічних концертів ми переважно не робимо, лише в тому випадку, коли це є певна дата, тобто коли було 250 років Бетховену, або 125 років Лятошинського, у нас були великі гала-проекти, і це було теж відкриття маловідомих або невідомих сторінок з життя і творчості цього композитора. Те, що стосується сучасної музики і замовлень, у нас відбувається переважно 2 шляхами. Перший шлях, звісно, це шлях друзів. Тобто, коли ти розумієш, що той чи інший композитор тобі підійде для цієї програми, і ти до нього звертаєшся і пропонуєш йому написати для того, щоб композитор виконав. Але мені здається, що найкращий момент, який дійсно працює, це коли встановлюється зв'язок між композитором та виконавцем. Тобто, коли вони один на одного самі виходять, бо це переростає в довготривалі зв'язки,
І ті замовлення, які у мене на фестивалі були від музикантів, від виконавців, вони були найбільш вдалими, і вони на майбутнє залишилися в репертуарі виконавців, що дуже важливо. Бо коли це замовляє куратор, у нього все-таки більш широке бачення, і це може бути щось тільки під фестиваль. А коли це замовляє виконавець, то тоді, оскільки це вже адресовано йому особисто, то він залишає в своєму репертуарі.
So normally the festivals that Luba is curating, they are not dedicated to any specific composer unless there is a reason for anniversary of any famous composer. So she basically uses two ways to create the content of the festival. First is to commission composers who she knows have the vision that is similar to the specific theme of the festival for a specific year. And in this case, the curator has like a broader view, and this work would normally fit the festival well, but often does not go beyond the performance at this particular festival. And the second way, which is kind of more long-lasting, is the collaboration between a performer and a composer. So Luba, you choose the performer and performer chooses the composer, or
a composer choose a performer. He could write to performer and to ask, do you want a performer could write to composers. And I had so good collaborations after festivals that continue and continue.
Okay, this was right.
Yes.
We have a question for Christopher, specifically about the issues around diversity. So since the festival at BART is based around one composer, how do you approach these issues of diversity in the repertoire?
Well, there are a couple of things. The festival, for a whole variety of reasons, has always focused on a dead composer. In part, there are other festivals and other ways of celebrating contemporary music. And we really are taking a historical sort of excavation of the past. That is part of our mission. But then within this context, of pretty much every composer we've done in the past, there have been looking, for example, what were women doing within the world of, more obviously, Schumann and Mendelssohn. That was much easier, but what about really any composer that we're looking at? And there's challenges now of what's really happening in the past year of opening this up as well in our current context right now to Black composers. But we did an entire festival around Chavez, Carlos Chavez, about 6 years ago, as really the preeminent Mexican composer of the 20th century, a good friend of Aaron Copland's. And we wanted to look at Central and South America, and this was the way to do this. I think for American audiences, the muralists and Frida Kahlo and so forth, and literature is more familiar than the classical musicians of the late 19th and 20th century. And so that was a way to explore it. And as I say, maybe we're, the idea that we really are looking to history is something that in the context of the Bard Festival raises different issues of diversity, because it has to be put in the context of a particular place in the 1850s or whatever.
Okay, I feel like we could sit here and have this conversation all day, and I would love that. But I don't want to cut too much into everyone's day, including our panelists. So I'm really, again, so grateful for your insight and your work and for sharing your perspective with us. I hope that everyone here enjoyed this presentation. We will post a recording on our YouTube channel if you want to revisit it at any point. And I hope that this is really sort of the start of the conversation, or maybe sort of at the beginning of the conversation, maybe not the start. That's probably a little bit too egoistic to think that we started this conversation. But this conversation around both Ukrainian programming and around how do we bring these unknown repertoires to audiences in compelling ways. So a number of the composers Luba mentioned, I'll just say, are being performed at our festival this weekend. Some of the young composers were performed last night, which you can still access if you have a ticket. And Zakhortsev, who was mentioned by Luba, is being performed tonight as part of our Kyiv avant-garde program, or the Shistosyaftniki program. So I invite you to join us there. That will start at 7:30 with a pre-concert talk by Peter Schmeltz. We did have one last question about the virtual element of this festival and whether or not we'll continue to do a virtual element. I guess we'll see sort of where the world is at. We would have loved to have brought Luba and Christopher together into the same room and had a real live conversation this year, which obviously we weren't able to do. But if we are able to do something like that in the future, I think we would try to maintain some kind of live broadcast, because I think it's very important that we reach beyond sort of the people that are local. And that's maybe one thing that we've gained from the pandemic. So thank you very much for joining us. And I hope that you found this helpful and interesting. And if you have any questions, please feel free to forward them to me. I can forward them to the panelists. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.